As we come to the end of this 5-week study on unanswered prayer, my guess is that many of us are left with unanswered questions. We've looked at the beauty and the agony of unanswered prayer. We've looked at the intimacy with God that we can choose in the midst of those seasons, but they're still hard. And so for this last reflection, I wanted to pick up on a central element in the last chapter of Pete's book, and he spent time talking about it in the video. And I want to get at it this way. Let me tell you about the 2 classes that I teach more frequently than any others. And they're my 2 favorite classes to teach. One is inductive Bible study, and the other is an introduction to biblical narrative, to the big story of Scripture. And they are 2 very different classes, but they complement each other in really unique ways. And I love when I get the chance to take students in consecutive semesters through both of them, and they begin to perceive how the 2 classes are related. So what does this have to do with our study on unanswered prayer? Well, in the inductive Bible study course, one of the main things that students are taught is to use the zoom lens on Scripture. They're taught to stop and see, to look closely at a small passage of Scripture, and to let that writer speak on his own terms, not to try to make Luke sound like Matthew or Mark sound like John, but to allow the writer to speak on his or her own terms and to look closely and deeply at the small pieces of that writing. So in one course, we're using the zoom lens. But in the other course, the Introduction to Biblical Narrative, we start with the big lens and an awareness that the individual pieces of Scripture and the individual voices of the biblical writers fit within a larger story, a story that has shape and movement, a story that is moving towards a conclusion, and that not just Scripture, but that we ourselves inhabit that big story. And this big story is a necessary piece. Having the panoramic lens is necessary if we're going to use the zoom lens well. Because even though each writer has his own voice, those voices fit within the big story of God's revelation of who he is and what he's doing in history. So that balance between the zoom lens and the panorama lens, I think that same lens change, if you will, is really important when we're contemplating our own stuff, our own suffering, and our own seasons of unanswered prayer. Just because we're human, it's almost inevitable that we'll gravitate towards the zoom lens. Our focus will be drawn to the thing that we're experiencing in the here and now. And we'll drill down into the details. Why is this happening? How long is it going to last? And unpacking and revolving over and over in our minds the suffering and the silence and the long seasons of drought that we may be experiencing. We analyze the details, we ruminate on them. Sometimes we get stuck in that rumination and it just becomes a churning within us. Now, while we're in the zoom lens and we're zeroing in on whatever this season is, there's some good questions to ask when we're doing that. And probably the most fruitful question that we can ask is not a why question, but what? Lord, what is it that you want me to learn in the midst of this thing, this thing that I'm looking at through the Zoom lens that's making no sense to me. What is it that you have for me in this? That's a question that trusts the goodness of God and trusts that we are not alone. But we don't need to stay with the Zoom lens on the camera at all times. In our suffering and our unanswered prayer and our seasons of drought, we need to make sure we pull back and put the panoramic lens back on the camera. Because we, in our tribulations and afflictions, are part of God's big story. And it's a story that has movement. It's a story that's moving toward a destination. And we have all kinds of clues in Scripture about what that destination is and how that final destination can shape our experience in the dark valley, in the shadow of death. When Jesus is declared to be the firstborn from the dead in chapter 1 of Revelation, that very clearly means that there will be others born from the dead. Jesus' resurrection is a promise of our resurrection. When John sees the new heavens and the new earth, that is a clear promise that the broken, messed up reality in which we are currently living, the brokenness that we see through our Zoom lens, that is not our final chapter. And it's not the final chapter of history. When Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, we shall all be changed, he is promising us that we will no longer be at war with our bodies. There is coming a day when the unanswered prayers for healing, when the yearning over the brokenness of our bodies or someone else's body, that will be replaced with a body that is eternal, immortal, and perfectly suited for life in the new heavens and the new earth. The struggle will no longer be part of our embodied existence. So, ladies, I encourage you, as you come out of this study, many of you may still find yourselves in seasons of unanswered prayer, of desert wanderings, of long, dark nights of the soul. And so I encourage you to be very intentional about viewing those things, not just through the Zoom lens, but also through the panoramic lens of the big story of Scripture. The good God who is actively at work to redeem creation and to redeem humanity, and who says there is coming a day when this redemptive work will be full and complete and over. So lean into that promise, ladies, and let the Lord who has redeemed you be the Lord who comforts you in your dark seasons. God bless you.